Welcome to another episode of the Find Your Voice podcast. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm actually going to have a conversation with someone. It is something I have not done on this podcast, and I feel like there are some conversations that I would love to share with you. And this is a conversation I had with Cliff Ravenscraft, who has been my coach and actually good friend for the past probably 8 years. Here's the conversation I had with Cliff about being at peace with others, even if sometimes that means you have to work through some mindset changes. Cliff Ravenscraft. That is a name you may have heard before, or you may have heard about him before, because I have shared quite a few discussions or conversations that we've had. I could say Cliff is pretty much an integral part in a lot of processes that I'm going through right now and that I've been going through, and in the way I think nowadays and the way my business works nowadays. Because first of all, we've been friends for years and we've been talking. Second of all, I have done coaching with Cliff actually for about a little more than a year actually. And also I was before, and I'm now again in his mastermind group that he facilitates with some high achievers. And there's quite a bit of talk about things like we're talking about today, the mindset. And I've talked about this quite a bit on this podcast here. If you reframe the way you think and your perception about the situation that you're in, you can really change your future if you look at it in a different way. And I want to talk today about how do you accept someone, anyone around you that you have to interact with, whether you want it or not. Sometimes we have a choice, sometimes we don't have a choice. And how can you be completely at peace? And how can you reframe things to where you can accept that person as who that person is and not find something wrong or faulty with that person? So, Cliff, I'm excited to talk to you today. And I just would like to open the conversation by asking you, in your personal life, tell me one situation where there was someone that it took time for you to work through to get to the point to understand that there's not anything inherently wrong with like who they are and what they do, but your reframing of the situation made you be at peace.
Well, Freya, thank you so much. It's an honor to be a guest on your podcast. I think, again, I may have been on in the past. I'm not sure. But I would say somebody that immediately comes to my mind would be my biological dad. So my biological dad was a drug addict and an alcoholic from the time I was born until he died in May of 2015. As a young kid, my mom and dad were married and together, and I remember those times. I don't recall anything negative that stands out other than, looking back, we lived in some not so savory places, and there was a lot of concern about the safety and of the environment. But outside of that, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. I mean, what else did I know other to compare it to? My mom and my biological dad got divorced when I was about 5 years old, and she remarried, who became my stepdad and actually has become my adopted dad after my biological dad passed away. When my mom and my biological dad got divorced, I always wanted to be a part of my dad's life. I couldn't understand, why is there this separation from me and my dad? This doesn't make a lot of sense to me as a little kid. And my mom warned me that it's for my safety, it's for my good. He does crazy things, and it's just best for you if you're not around him. However, I consistently begged to be around my dad. And there were times when my dad was trying to, straighten up a little bit. He definitely wanted to have me as a part of his life. And there were seasons of my childhood that I recall spending time with my dad. until I was an adult and after he passed away, I never really recalled anything good about those times. In fact, it was right around when I was 18 years old that my memory of anything good between me and my dad kind of was just swept under a rug. And I only allowed myself to remember all of the not so savory things. And there were plenty of them. And I remember one time when I was a little toddler and I'm hanging out with my dad and he's with his friends and they're doing whatever they're doing, drugs, whatever. And this one guy is standing at the top of these stairs, and I wanted to go outside and play. And I just remember very specifically these words: if you if you walk down those steps and go out that door, I will cut your throat. And he had a big, sharp knife. So this is just some slight example. I won't go into all the details. There were some pretty traumatic situations throughout the young adult life that I recall from my dad. And when I was 18 years old, my dad invited me to go on a cruise with him. And maybe I wasn't 18 yet. I might have been 16, 17, but it was right around this time frame. I went on this cruise and it was a whole 7 days. And my dad was in the bar pretty much all of the time, except for when he was in our cabin. But when he was in our cabin, he was not in bed. He was in the bathroom throwing up the entire time. So this was my experience with my dad for an entire week. And he was incredibly rude and incredibly nasty to everyone. And and we did go to dinners together, the cruise dinners that you go on. And he was incredibly rude and nasty to the staff. He's drunk and all this other stuff. And I'm like, this is the worst experience I've ever had in my life. I've never had the whole 7 days confined in such small quarters. And I came away from that experience with, I don't know that I actually want to spend any more time with my dad. And so that's kind of how I felt, except for the fact that there was a part of me growing up that says honor your mother and father and you should respect your parents and, unconditional love. If you're a Christian, you wouldn't hate anyone and all this other stuff. And so out of guilt, I would spend Thanksgiving with my dad and go see him at Christmas time. But outside of that, not much more than that. So he was barely a part of our wedding. And then when we started having kids, he showed up at the hospital each time a child was born. And even still, it's like Thanksgiving and Christmas, that's dad time. Anything else out of that's the only time I have to put up with him. And this is the way that I would think about it, that I have to put up with him. And I felt so much guilt and shame for not loving my dad. I felt so much guilt and shame in a way for at the time. I would even say that I hated him. The way that and at the time I would use this language, the way he made me feel. And it was before I learned about the fact that I'm in control of how I react and respond to situations and the things that I've discovered about mindset today. Long story, not short because it's already very long. What I will say is that the scenario played out to where my dad had a bunch of psychotic breaks, was in mental institution for the mental ward of a hospital for periods of time when he had these breaks. And I would go see him and that was not pleasant. And then I would stop going to see him. Then eventually he had some pretty severe medical issues and surgery that left him pretty much disabled. And rather than take him in our guest bedroom in our home that we had just built, my second cousin, their son and daughter-in-law, took my dad in their guest room in their basement because he was living alone. And the person he had been seeing, the girl he had been seeing, which was a really interesting relationship, was taking advantage of him. And they finally kicked her out and they took him in. And I just couldn't handle it at the time. Emotionally, I was not in a place where I could handle any of those scenarios. It was just a terrible experience. And that was our experience. I would go see him in the hospital when he was, in the hospital. And it's like, you can leave if you want. I can tell you don't want to be here, that kind of thing. And the very last time I saw my dad was he was in a rehabilitation center for a physical scenario that had come up. I went and visited him. I sat in the lunchroom with him and then took him back to his room. And as soon as he started yelling and was really nasty to the nurses and things like that, I said, listen, if that's the way you're going to be, I'm out of here. I don't want anything to do with it. He goes, well, just leave then. And those were the last words between myself and my biological dad. And he died then, I think within 48 hours of that, and I was out of town. So there's somebody that I had a very difficult and challenging time with. The ironic thing, Freya, today, I will tell you that I absolutely love my dad. And I think he was an incredibly awesome father, and he did the best he could with everything he had to work with. Since dealing with a lot of my own personal belief systems, working through some of my experiences of the past where I had maybe laid blame on my dad for so many things, I had not taken responsibility for how I was processing things. And of course, some of the things I was like, well, how could I? I was a kid. But there, even as a young adult, there were things that I started to just shovel the responsibility of my own reactions onto my dad. I figured it's easier to blame him. And it's okay for me to have this distance between my dad. And one of the reasons it was kind of a protection mechanism for me at the time to suppress anything good about my experience with my dad and only remember the bad, because that validated in my mind emotionally the fact that I want nothing to do with him, and I have a guest bedroom in our home that we just built and I don't want him in it. And so I did not recognize until after he was dead that that's what I was doing. So that's how I'll answer your question. And we can do as much as you want in conversation to unpack how I got to the place where now today I look back fondly upon my dad.
I think what you said really resonates with me about he did the best he could with what he had to work with. And I feel like maybe I never understood that until years later, but I had also a very difficult situation with my dad at home. Part of my story, is dramatic also, except my mom did not divorce. They, until I was 20 years old, I endured this. And it was drama every single day. I cried every single day. My dad yelled and screamed every single day. He was always drunk. He did sometimes have periods of a few months where he would stop drinking, and then he was an entirely different person. I never, which is really interesting because I never got to that point, although he treated me so, so badly and he hurt me so bad emotionally sometimes. I never had that point where I felt like I blamed anyone for anything, really. I never blamed him for anything. I always had this part of me that kind of felt sorry and understood, because he was like these two different persons in one. And I already understood that his addiction is causing him to act in ways that he then, when he gets sober again, he hates it. He hates himself. He just can't seem to get out of it. And he also doesn't want help. We know people who have an addiction, they always think they are in control and they don't need outside help. It's like, no, if I wanted to, I could totally fix it. I just don't want to do it. And I'm very grateful for always having been in that mindset, even though I didn't understand much back then, but I kind of already had that inside. There was this wisdom of there's nothing he can do differently right now, because this is just what he has. He has that addiction and he's not getting help. And without the help and without him deciding he wants to change, he didn't decide he's going to change and he's never doing this again. So his decision was, I will just keep on going and tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that will be the same. So I never had resentment, which I'm grateful for. On the other hand, however, I became someone who always wanted to please everyone because that's kind of how I catered to my dad. So he wouldn't get too mad at me. Because I was so empathic and understood, I watched him very closely. It was like a ticking time bomb. And, you could say one wrong thing or move the wrong way and it would set him off like a bomb. So I became so good at watching other people across from me who I interacted with and kind of reading them. And that's kind of like, even in my marriage, I all I wanted was to be loved and to be accepted because my dad never had that. He was always getting onto me and putting me down. But it's the other extreme. There was not a resentment, but there was this almost giving up myself completely in order to help that other person that I think that person needs help, and I'm going to be that good Samaritan helping that person. So you said, like, it validated you, it validated you being in, having those feelings and not talking to him because he was so horrible and he acted like that. It kind of validated you. So my question is, do we need any validation for the way we feel? That's always the issue, because I always feel like you feel the way you feel. There's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just the way it is. And we've talked about this before. It's like, what if you just didn't want someone in your life? You don't have to justify that. Like, how did you get to that point to where you didn't need that validation anymore to kind of like, I'm not a bad person not to be talking to my dad because he's this person and that validates me acting in this way. What if he had been a nice person you didn't want to talk to him? What if someone just isn't good for you in your life and distracts you, or maybe they're not a bad person?
So for me, I didn't have that experience when my dad was still alive. So for me, I had the belief that I needed some sort of justification and validation for setting a boundary. Today, I no longer have that. Today, matter of fact, I'm convinced that if I knew everything that I know now, that I could be in an incredibly powerfully positive relationship with my father. And at the same time, I could still have boundaries if he continued to cross them and did things that were beyond what I felt were acceptable to in front of me, treating other people and or in front of my children. So today, I would absolutely agree. I did not, looking back, I now see that I did not need any justification to set a boundary. But back then, I did not have that clarity. Back then, I felt so much guilt, I felt so much shame, and I felt like as a Christian and as a son, being his only like descendant, I mean, his mom and dad died when he was a teenager, and his brother died when I was young, and he literally lives with his aunt and all of his cousins, and that's his only family other than me. And so I felt like some burden and responsibility that as a Christian and as a son, I should love my dad and I should be there because I'm his only quote unquote direct living relative. And there was a belief system that says this is who I am and this is the way I should be, and it's living up to what I believed was the expectations of others about what my responsibility in the relationship should be. Now, whether or not those expectations were there from other people, I have no idea. It's just that it was the belief system that I had accumulated up until that point in my time. It's the values that I had been conditioned to have through my experiences. So today, to answer your question, is no. Do I need validation? Do I need to create a checklist of all the things that he does that gives me the right to set a boundary? The answer is no. I could just set a boundary and I can choose at any point in my life who I do and do not want to invest my time, effort, and energy with. And I don't need it, it's not about right or wrong, it's about what I desire. But to come to that place, I had to, number one, had to understand what beliefs that I had, and learning and understanding what unconscious beliefs that I had. So there were beliefs that I was very much aware of. And then there are beliefs that I wasn't even aware that I had that belief. And and all of a sudden emotions would get triggered and I was unaware of what was causing these things. And it
Tell me
wasn't
some
until
examples of the things that you were feeling that you might not have been aware of. What were some things you were telling yourself?
I would just say that my dad would call and he would leave a message and he'd say, "Hey, it's 9:58. It's me. I just wanted to chat with you. I haven't talked to you in a while. Really hoping things are going well with you and the kids, blah blah blah," and all this other stuff. And that would be a voicemail. And then there would be 17 more voicemails before I ended my workday. And all of a sudden, I feel this feeling of overwhelm. I feel this feeling of stress. I feel like, what does this mean? What do I have to do? Is like, I haven't heard from this guy in like 7.5 months. And now he's called me 17 times today. What's going on in his world? What does he want? And all, but for me, all of a sudden it triggered an emotional reaction. And what I wasn't aware of at the time is that that emotional reaction is that I'm somehow responsible and it's my duty as a son to call him back and to chat with him, to be friendly, to see what's going on and see if we can't spend some time together, even though I desperately want to avoid any time spent with him.
So there's a dissonance inside of you that's like struggling.
Exactly. It's like, oh my gosh, here I've gone 7 months and I forgot that my dad existed. And now his 17 messages remind me that he still exists. And now, oh my gosh, over the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months, am I going to be put into some incredibly uncomfortable situations that I feel obligated to have? But I didn't know what was happening underneath. I didn't know that there was a belief inside unconsciously that somehow I feel obligated to go and spend time with him, that I feel obligated to, pretend that everything is hunky-dory between us. And those were unconscious beliefs that caused a lot of dissonance, and they caused a lot of negative and anxious and very undesired emotional states within me.
I have a question. So let's just assume he were still alive and where that's still that same person. How would you deal with that phone call now? What would be your thought process now?
Yeah, it's like, oh, well, my dad's in a season of life right now where it crossed his mind to reach out to me and say, hey, how things going? Yeah, it's been a while since I've reached out to him. I wonder what's going on in his world. I wonder what's prompted him to call me several times today. It's interesting. I'm curious. When I get a chance later, I'm going to give him a call and ask him what's going on. I literally would have no negative emotional response today. I would just recognize, oh, here's a pattern. My dad has seasons of life when he goes into this state of being and this behavioral system, and there are seasons when he comes out of it. And when he comes out of it, he likes to contact me a lot. And I just know that this is who he is. It's not a big deal. I'm working today, and after 5 o'clock, I'll give him a call and say, hey, what's up? I noticed you called me a couple of times. How are things going? What's going on in your world?
That's a really important thing that I've learned in the past few years. We both read Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements. It's one of the four agreements: don't make assumptions. And I feel like that has helped me greatly when I interact with anyone now. I don't make assumptions like why, what is their motive? What are they, we often tend to, I think in a way it makes us feel better about ourselves sometimes to assume the negative about someone else. But not making that assumption about someone is like, oh, he's doing that because he wants to do something bad to me. I feel that I don't know if there are exceptions. I actually literally feel that every single human being, they get up in the morning and they genuinely want to do the right thing, what they believe is the right thing. Even now, this sounds really horrible, but even someone like a terrorist, Mohammed Atta, I watched a documentary about him recently, you know, the guy who hit the first World Trade Center tower, the first one. He flew that plane, and his life story, he genuinely believed in his belief system. He did the right thing, the noble thing. He died for the cause. Like, for example, right now, my daughter, she's almost 12, but she's a little too young to understand some of these things. But how do you work through issues that you have with someone that you, I don't want to say you ever have to be around someone. No one is making you, even when you have a job and you have a boss or a spouse, it's not like anyone's putting a gun to your head and you have to. What would you advise someone who feels like they are suffering consistently because they feel like they're at someone's mercy, and that someone is just doing them wrong, but they don't feel like they have the authority to ask that person to either not do this, whatever causes them to feel pain anymore, or to decide, I just don't want to interact with that person.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is I think there are some people who are in situations where they are forced to be around some people. So, for example, I think of somebody who's in prison. They may have a cellmate that is not within their control.
Yeah, that's true.
Uh, so that's a scenario. Somebody could be a young child who is not old enough to legally go out and live their own life, and so they may be in a home with parents that are not pleasant to be around. And so that's a scenario that some children find themselves in. And if I had to imagine, there are probably some other scenarios that I'm not thinking of, but you're speaking to what about in the situations where we do have a little bit more agency in who we spend time with. So the question I have is, what is your question that you're asking me is how do you manage the relationship when you're with and around those people that are you're there, or what are the steps to take to get your self outside of the relationship or physicality of that person?
I think, what if, my question, I guess, is what if you can't avoid the relationship? You have to continue interacting with that person, but you feel like you're suffering so much every time you're around this person. Let's just say, in the example of children, they have to go to school and they have that teacher. They can't just say, I'm not doing this anymore.
Okay.
How would you guide them through that? What mental shift would they have to go through?
One of the things that I would do is, and it would be difficult, especially in a situation with a child, to depending on their age, if they can understand it. But at some point, I would begin having the conversation and using language like, I want you to understand it's not this person and what they did or what they said or this situation or this circumstance that's causing you suffering. It's what you're thinking about this person. It's what you're thinking about what they said. It's what you're thinking about what they did. It's what you're thinking about this situation. It's what you're thinking about the circumstance that is causing the suffering within you. It is your belief that things should be other than what they currently are. There is a book called Loving What Is by Byron Katie. And Byron Katie has this process called self-inquiry called the work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have not read anything from her as when it comes to doing the work with kids, but I know that she has material, or at least I believe that she has material on how to do the work with children. And that's something that I would probably look a little bit more into, because
She
that's
does the same thing really that she does with the adults, maybe just different language, but it's really this question, is it true?
Yeah. It's going to be the same questions. And so there are 4 main questions and 2 bonus questions. So the question is what are you upset about? What are you angry? Name a person and what they did or said. All right. What are you angry about? What do you think that they should have done? What do you think should be the situation here? Really judge the situation, because that's what you're doing anyway, is you're judging the situation.
Let me be my daughter now. So why am I upset? Okay, so I'm upset because my teacher points me out in front of my friends and I feel like I'm so embarrassed. I feel so bad then. And they shouldn't be doing that because I feel bad.
Okay. So the belief here is that I am suffering because my teacher points out things and I'm embarrassed. So, and I don't believe that my teacher should point me out. And there's another one. I don't believe that my friends should judge me when I get pointed out. All
Yes.
right. So we would have to choose one of those 2 to focus on for just a moment. Which of the 2 thoughts would you like to focus on first? My teacher shouldn't point me out, or my friends shouldn't laugh at me when I get pointed out?
No, my teacher, because I feel like he's completely in fault. Like he's the cause for my discomfort.
Okay. So my teacher shouldn't point me out. Point me out. The first question is that true that the teacher should not do that?
And here's the explanation I give my daughter. He has to make sure there's order in the classroom with 30 children. If he just says yes and amen to everyone, there will be chaos. He needs to give instructions.
Well, the thing is he shouldn't do this, but he's doing it. And so it's not going to be easy to put this in a third party conversation like this. So what I'd like to do is I would refer to go and say, go find some examples of Byron Katie doing work with children and see how this goes. And then you can see how that conversation will flow. But here's what I can share with you. Here are the questions, and here's what I've discovered about the questions and how they work. So the first question is it true that this should not happen? Well, that's in, and by the way, the answer has to be, it's not the answer, well, I know why he's doing it, or this is why he's doing it. But no, the question is, should he point people out, students out? The answer is either yes or no. And there may be a strong feeling that yes, it is true that he should not do this. That's embarrassing. And he shouldn't embarrass students. All right. So the next question is, can you absolutely know for certain that he should not call students out? And again, this is a yes or no question. So the question is like, okay, so the first one, my gut instinct says, yes, I believe it's true. My belief that this should not be happening. I should be completely left to my own devices and I should not be called out. I absolutely believe this. And it's like, okay, can you absolutely know for sure that this should not happen, that this is not right? And if the person is a little bit, if they can disassociate from the emotion just enough, there's a wisdom inside that says, well, the fact is that it is happening. So that's what's called reality. And what my thought or belief is that what is, or reality, should not be. And so my belief is in opposition to what is actually taking place. So the goal of these questions is to understand, it's like, wait, our assumptions that this shouldn't be happening is somewhat flawed, but occasionally the answer will even be yes to the second question. A lot of people can say no instantly to the first question. Is that true? It's like, I've never questioned my belief that that shouldn't happen. But now that you ask me that question, of course my teacher should do it. There's lots of good reasons why he should do it. And it immediately snaps them out of the suffering. All right. The second question, if they say yes to the first question, no, I believe it. Then the second question might bring them to an understanding that, wait, this belief that this shouldn't happen, it's not a realistic belief. But let's just say they still say yes to the first 2 questions, because we'll go there. So we move to the third question in Byron Katie's work, and that is, what happens, or how do you feel or show up when you hold the belief or thought that the teacher should not call me out. And that's typically going to be a negative emotion or a list or string of negative emotions. I feel angry. I feel hurt. I feel rejected. I feel humiliated, and all these other things because I don't believe this should happen. All right. And so, okay, so we've got all of that. So when you hold the belief that this should not happen and this happens, this is how you experience. You experience all of this suffering. Is that what you're telling me? Yes. Okay. Next question. How would you be, or how would you feel, or how would you show up if you did not hold the thought or belief that the teacher should not do this? Like you couldn't even have the thought that what your teacher is doing is wrong. How would you feel? How would you show up? Well, if I was not allowed to access that thought, I would probably be a little taken back, but I would probably be a little bit of curious about why did this happen? I might even be able to look around and see the scenario, and I mean, it might even be a little bit more respectful of what's gone on and my participation in being a distraction. I'd probably be a lot more open, and I would probably not judge myself. I would just recognize that maybe this isn't the approach. That's how I think I might show up. Wonderful. Okay, great. Now, there are two bonus questions. Number one, can you see any good reason to let go of the thought or the belief that your teacher should not call you out? And the answer is almost always yes. Yeah, there's some good reasons. All right. And then the answer to the next question, can you think of any good reason, and here's the key, that does not cause stress, that does not cause suffering, to hold on to the thought or belief that this person should not be calling you out? And the answer is no. And I'm like, okay, so you understand that it's the thought that this shouldn't happen, that when it happens, that causes you suffering. And it causes you to show up this way. But if you didn't have the thought, you would show up in a completely different, non-suffering way. So moving forward, you now have a choice. Do you want to hold on to the thought and the belief that this shouldn't happen? Or do you want to just let it go? It's up to you. But and I can't tell you which decision to choose, but it seems to me like there's some good reasons to drop the thought or belief that this teacher shouldn't call me out. And it doesn't seem like there's any reason to hold the belief moving forward that doesn't cause me suffering.
Let's talk a little bit more about parenting, because I know that Stephanie, your wife, and you very similar to me. You did probably a few things a little bit different when you raised your kids than maybe some others would have suggested you should do. Like in well, we always get this, like there's this kind of mainstream, like this is what you do and this is how this is how you raise kids and this is how you discipline kids and whatever. I personally, I don't even like that word disciplining. In German, we say, well, we have some words that I don't even like using those words, because I feel like the word, it's not describing what I'm doing here. I'm guiding, I'm directing, I'm accompanying, I'm partnering, and I'm I want to be respected. But can you talk a little bit about, like, how did you raise your kids when it comes to, we all know kids sometimes do things that we know it's not good for them, and they sometimes hit a nerve because they of course don't want to always cooperate. And then we have to think about, like, how can we solve this to where it's good for everyone involved? No one wants to freak out. But how has your past influenced, and of course Stephanie's part of that too, how has your past had an influence on how you have raised your kids? Because I know my past has a huge impact on how I show up with my kids and how I interact. I would just be interested.
Well, in the earliest days of our parenting, for the first maybe 3 to 5 years of Megan's life, and for the first year and a half, 2 years of Matthew's life, we were negatively influenced by the way that we were parented. And so we kind of just assumed that the way that we were parented was the way that parenting, quote unquote, should be done. And that's like, let me just, the louder I raise my voice, the more serious you're going to take what I say. And the more severe the punishment, the more likely you're going to be to decide in the future to not make similar mistakes. And so there was a lot of yelling, a lot of punishing, and it was not a very great experience. And there was a program at the church that we were doing at this one time. It was by a couple named Gary and Anne Marie or Marie Ezzo, and it was called Growing Kids God's Way. Probably one of the most traumatic parenting tools you could ever have, given a Christian parent. But I will tell you that we implemented that strategy of growing kids God's way and had all sorts of expectations about, and in a way,
It sounds
it
almost like
all,
growing kids, like growing some
yeah.
plants you sow
Well,
out.
and there's even this belief that, and there's this one scripture that says, instruct the children on the way that they should go, and they will not deviate from it. Don't spare the rod, and all this other stuff. It was a very kind of, it's like, listen, if you get, it's almost as though you're raising your kids to be in the military. It's like, yes sir, no sir. You
Yeah.
always say yes ma'am, no ma'am to these people, and here are all of the things that you do. These are all of the right things that you must always do. Here are all the wrong things you must always and we bought into that so much, though, that we not only attended this and implemented it. Stephanie and I actually led this course. It was one of those DVDs that you play, and a couple parents are here, and we've got the workbooks, and we're having this discussions and all this stuff. And oh man, still to this day, my sincere apologies to Megan. Matthew doesn't remember it a whole lot, but Megan still has some of those memories. But things shifted over time, and eventually we got to this place where it's like, listen, this is not how we want to parent. I'm done with this. And we
See,
had,
what told you that? You had that inner wisdom. It just told you it was wrong. No one said
yeah,
that, but your feeling, your intuition told you this is not how I want to treat my children.
yeah, yeah. And so, ironically, before we even had those experiences, one of the things that Stephanie and I had made a decision consciously is that we didn't want to raise children. Instead, what we said is we want to raise responsible young adults who contribute to society in a positive way. And one of the things that we did do right early on was we always communicated openly and honestly with our kids. We never kind of, sugar-coated reality or anything of that nature. We never tried to protect them from understanding what's going on in the world around them. And we never did that baby talk with them. Not that there's anything wrong with baby talk, but we always spoke to our kids openly, authentically, transparently. Now, we were very much influenced by some not great parenting techniques and tools and strategies. But once we realized this is not how we want to parent, we went to Megan specifically and said, listen, we are not going to hold you to this standard anymore. We don't think that this is the right way to do this. I think and we just told her we're sorry for the way that we've handled this so far, and moving forward, here's what we would like. And at any point, if you have questions, feel free to let us know. And let's work together and have dialogue about what your experience in this family is like when you're here under our roof, and when you're out and about. If you run into any scenarios where you don't know how to handle a situation, just know that you can always come to us, and we're not going to tell you what you should think. We're going to tell you what we think and let that influence how you think. And you get to make your decisions and your choices about what your experience will be and what you believe. And that's the other thing, is we had this radical shift in our faith upbringing. My faith upbringing is like, this is what you believe. Here are all the things. Agree with all of this, disagree with all of this, stay away from this. And when all of a sudden I began to experience what I call personal freedom, I wanted that more than anything for our kids. And that's when things shifted. So here's some things that was ironic for us. One of the things that we've never had any problem with is language with our kids. Like, you shouldn't use these curse words or whatever. And the fun part is that in our home, our kids will have, let's say, flowery language. They have free flowing words that in most places people's cheeks would turn red to hear what was just said that came out of the mouth of, at the time, this 13 or 14-year-old, right? The ironic thing is that in public, our kids were like super like this, or and whatever, very respectful of the environment. Now, the interesting thing is that when they're with their friends at high school or middle school or whatever, that in their own private conversations, they're like having these, they're using this language all the time, right? It's a part of the way that they speak, is this language. And they would invite their friends over, and in the comfort and safety of our home, one of our children might say something and use a word that would be unacceptable in practically any other home with mom and dad around, right? And they would say it, and it would be just as normal as they would say it on the playground or at a whatever. And their friends are like, oh, it's like, and then my one of my kids was like, what's the big deal? I can't believe you just said that in front of your mom and dad. It's like, why? And yeah, so there are definitely things that we allowed our kids to have freedom, because I recognize that outside of the home, if they're going to be around these people, these are going to be some of the things they do or say, and they have to make the decision. Is this the way that I want to communicate? And more than anything, I said, listen, just be aware of how people react to the words you speak, and choose your words wisely in each environment you enter into.
I feel like for me, it was always really important to treat my kids actually exactly the way that I want them to treat everyone else, with respect. And I always didn't, you have to, of course, when they're very small, you're going to have to tell them absolutely no, even if they're yell and scream. I mean, a 2-year-old, they don't understand, of course. But a 12-year-old, I feel like there's so much potential for terrible rebellion and completely turning the back on your upbringing and your parents and your family when you feel like no one tries to understand where you're coming from. No one truly listens to you. So it always felt wrong to me to tell my child, this is wrong, period. But to talk about it and to open up the conversation of like, this is why I think I don't like it, and I would appreciate it if we don't do it this way. But I want to listen to you and understand, what do you have to say about it? Like, why did you do this? How do you, I want to respect everyone, really everyone. I think I always wanted to teach my kids, and that's our topic today, really, to accept everyone as who they are, first and foremost. First and foremost, everyone is a fellow human being, and I think they would deserve this base level of respect that I feel we should have for everyone. Doesn't matter what they do and who they are and what they say. Before we make the decision, to judge someone, and I feel like we should always search in ourselves sometimes about the judgments that we make, because it says a lot about us. Coming back to our topic of like, how are you at peace with who everyone is? Like your children, your spouse, the people you work with. How can you be always at peace with who everyone is?
So the way that works for me is to recognize that everyone, as we experience them, is a product of all of their conditioned beliefs up to that point in their life, and they're a product of the environment that they grew up in and that they're a part of habitually today. They are the product of their habits and routines, of their habitual way of thinking, their habitual way of feeling, and a lot of that is because of the beliefs that they've adopted over time. And as a result of that, any person who is doing anything can only do that thing because at all times they're doing the best that they can with what they have to work with. I also have this philosophy that I can't think of any exception to this, but I'm a firm believer that nearly everyone every day wakes up and is trying to do what they think is right. I also have that very firm belief. And what one person from the next thinks of is right is going to be based upon so many things. Now, the thing is that it's very clear that in my times of lower levels of consciousness, I may have done things that clearly I know are wrong, and that I even have values that says I should never do this, but yet I did it, right? So at that time, what I'm saying is that if I go back, I can tell you that there's a reason why I did it. And it wasn't because I was bad. It was just that in the moment, I had some level of belief that I would have more pleasure and avoid more pain by doing what I did in the moment. And I got caught up in it. And that is why I did this. And at the moment, it seemed like the only logical thing for me to do. And I may have not even been acting logically. I may have not even been consciously aware of what I did. It could have been just an automatic response to something that has been a system of routine and habit throughout my lifetime. And one of the things that I learned is like, wow, how many times in my life do I have dissonance with what I believe is right and wrong, and yet I still do things that are not in pure alignment with what I think is pure and love and good and holy and perfect? Well, I don't know about you, Freya, but for me, there's a number of those scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so my question is that if that's true for me, then why couldn't that also be true for every other human on the planet? So what if I forgive others as I've been forgiven? What if I stop judging others, and what if I stop judging myself? What if I allow myself the grace to be who I am in all of the faults that I may experience? And then instead of judging myself when I recognize something, it's like, oh, I did something that I really, looking back, kind of, regret's a strong word, but man, if I had to do that over again, I probably would have done that. I would have handled that scenario different right now than I did yesterday, than when I did it. And that still occurs for me in my life. And then the question is like, okay, instead of judging myself and saying, oh, I'm so terrible, why do I always do this terrible thing? Now it's like, oh, wow, I did that. That's less than desirable. That's not what I prefer. Gosh, if I was to do that over again, I can see how I could have done this differently. Maybe I can dig in and reflect on, why did I make that decision? What was I thinking? What was I feeling at the time? Is that true? Is there any reason why I would just want to now let go of that belief or that thought of this thing? Is there any different way that I want to start showing up? What new beliefs should I adopt to make that possible? And, given the scenario with what's happened with this person, how can I go and make it right? What can I do and say to make it better? I can't change what I did, but is there anything that I can do to make it right? And if they're open to it, great. If they're not, I understand. That it is what it is. It's a missed or lost opportunity. And wow, I will log that under my list of consequences of when I show up in that undesirable, non-preferred way. And if I give myself the freedom to do that, why can't I just grant that grace and freedom to every other human?
I absolutely believe I always want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. and not assume anything terrible or negative. Although sometimes it's very easy. It's very easy to fall into this emotion and to just freak out. I mean, I catch myself. But again, because I'm doing it, like you just said, why can't I give everyone that grace? Because I do it. Even toward my kids, I often have to apologize. I'm like, I'm sorry. I like hormonal. That's not an excuse, but that was harsh what I just said and how I reacted. And it's because I'm human. I apologize. It's not what I ever want to do. I'm going to work on this to already show everyone else I try my best, but it isn't always what you perceive as the best. But giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. I think that's, as human beings, there's quite a lot going on in each and every one. When I see anyone that I don't even know, I always think there's this entire life story behind that person, all those experiences, everything that has gone into who they are now. I have no idea what they have experienced and how they got where they are right now. So we really shouldn't make assumptions.
Yeah. If there's one book that I would recommend that's a quick read is The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. It will talk to you about being impeccable with your word. That's how you speak about others, how you speak to yourself. That is incredibly powerful. And then don't make assumptions, don't take anything personally, and always do your best. And your best will always change in every moment of every day.
And in that, we're going to close here. Thank you so much, Cliff. There's so much we could always talk about. I very much enjoy these conversations. Like, how can we show up the best way we possibly can in this world? Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Freya. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much for watching. Consider subscribing on your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I use personally Overcast. You can find it there, and then you can listen whenever you're on the go. Have an amazing day, and remember, dream big, because big dreams do come true.